helping to create a new army of activists ready to use people power to fight against social and economic injustice. Let's give a big welcome to Steve Zunes and David Solar.
Thank you. What I was thinking of was looking at five and a half struggles, basically, from the United States around the world. Give a very brief description of what happened and what lessons that we can draw from them. And I'll start with a movement that I was first involved in, my first arrest at age 19. And that was the struggle against nuclear power in the mid to late 1970s. What struck me about that movement was that, as many of you know, in the late 60s, early 70s, the anger, the frustration of the continuing slaughter in Indochina, but also the radicalization on the positive side, and the radicalization that took place from people realizing that Vietnam wasn't an aberration, but symptomatic of some broader structural problems with American militarism and capitalism. The movement ended up going in some directions that, on the one hand, were positive, again, more radical critical analysis, but in some areas, there became almost a fetishization of armed struggle. You had this kind of alphabet soup of Marxist-Leninist factions and splinters and whatever, each mostly these middle-class white guys, you know, assisting maybe the vanguard of the working class or whatever, and ended up in this around with property destruction and other forms of resistance that, you know, may have felt cathartic, but actually was used by the state for greater repression. Led to a dramatic decline in the movement. That, along with the war finally winding down, the movement came out of the mid-70s in a series of these anti-nuclear coalitions: the Clamshell Alliance in New England, the Abalone Alliance here in California, and literally dozens in other parts of the country. Were based on a strong piece away from this rigid, Leninist hierarchy to a very decentralized, even anarchist kind of structure based on affinity groups, small consensus decision making, but also a firm commitment to strategic, nonviolent action. And what was the movement there started off, interestingly, as something, usually when you think of groups going to civil disobedience, you think of it as after we have tried to work within the system and after you have majority support, but the system is rigged against it, so you need to escalate to nonviolent action. But at the time the move began, polls showed the majority of Americans actually supported nuclear power. And so, because you had the utility companies having these great ads, and you get these little flyers in your utility bill every month talking about how it was safe and clean and efficient and the key to our future and that kind of thing. And so, in many ways, when you start getting people arrested, people say, well, why are you getting arrested at a nuclear power plant site? They're trying to build a nuclear power plant. Why do you oppose it being safe, clean, and efficient? People started asking questions. And the questions grew as the numbers grew. There was an incident I remember up in Oregon, where it escalated not just to try to stop the construction of new nuclear power plants, but to try to decommission an existing nuclear power plant at the Trojan facility just north of Portland. Which was known for its inept and corrupt operations. Indeed, there was a young man growing up there by the name of Matt Groening who used that as the model for the Springfield nuclear power plant in The Simpsons. But But I remember when some people were arrested, they were actually, when they went to trial, they're actually able to use the competing harms defense, which is sort of the principle, yes, we technically violated the law, but it's to prevent a greater harm from taking place. Very few, a lot of groups, a lot of people have tried that before. Only a handful of judges allow it. They did in this case. You know, it's the kind of principle in law that, yes, I may have engaged in jaywalking, goes to prevent this kid from being run over by a car, or something, you know, that is the equivalent of that. And so they allowed to make the case against nuclear power. Not only were they acquitted, but 3 of the 12 jurors joined in the next civil disobedience action because they had been educated about the dangers of nuclear power. But in many ways, what this did was it was a kind of the idea that was first put forward, you know, by Che Guevara and Regis Debray, the FOCO theory, the idea of propaganda. You do something that's dramatic, a little outrageous, it will inspire people who are apathetic and powerless to support. The trouble was it didn't really work with armed struggle because not everybody's quite willing to pick up a gun, especially if you're going to get killed. Which, of course, we know what happened to Che. It didn't work very well. But it does seem to work in nonviolent action, and because indeed the movement mushroomed. And what was significant about that was even though they went ahead and they built the Seabrook nuclear power plant, or at least one of the two, because it was half successful, they ran the second reactor. And even though they went ahead and built the nuclear power plant at Diablo Canyon, even though it's quite a few years before they closed down the Trojan facility, not a single new nuclear power plant has been ordered since 1978. Maybe this new one they're talking about in Georgia, but I have a feeling that's not going to happen for financial reasons alone. But in all these years, Nixon had declared there would be 1,000 nuclear power plants by the year 2000. And it looks like we're peaking at around 120. And what happened, basically, was that when the 3 Mile Island accident happened in March of 1979, this was, came within 45 minutes of a Chernobyl, Fukushima-style meltdown right in the heart of Pennsylvania. You've gotten to the Susquehanna River, an island in the Susquehanna, floating to Chesapeake Bay, one of the greatest estuaries in the country. I mean, you've been a huge, huge tragedy. But there have been 2 other nuclear accidents that were just about as bad. They're here, just about as close. Brown's Ferry in Alabama, in Germany, in Michigan. And we didn't find out how close they were until years and years later. The reason was that when the media came, the utility companies reassured, oh, everything's under control, whatever. And they believed it. But because there was this movement out there, because there were skeptical questions, the media actually started asking the tougher questions. And lo and behold, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which like most regulatory commissions in the U.S. government was largely captured by the very industry it's supposed to regulate, had to start, believe it or not, enforcing their regulations because the eyes of the country were on it. And that was what made nuclear power no longer affordable. And that's why, again, we haven't had any new nuclear power plants built since that time. There's an excellent book that I highly recommend any activist to read. It's by the late Bill Moyer, not to be confused with Bill Moyers, the journalist, or Bill Moyer of the Backbone campaign. Bill Moyer, who lived many years here in San Francisco, has a book based on his movement action plan, based on the name of it. Doing Democracy. Doing Democracy by Bill Moyer, which looks at the various phases of nonviolent movements and uses the nuclear power movement, in which he was a major strategist, and how it evolves. And it's a great book on a number of reasons. It looks at the different kinds of activists and the positive and negative sides of what they bring in. It looks at often how people, the different phases. There is a phase for direct action, but there are also phases where other approaches are appropriate, and how to know when these are, and not feel like you're losing when you're actually just entering a different phase. It was a critically important book, and I would highly I highly recommend that one. The second movement I want to look at took place in the mid-1980s, and actually started before then. It was in the Philippines. It was a classic case of a U.S.-backed dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, who had a martial law regime, brutally suppressed any kind of opposition. A very moderate, kind of centrist democratic reformer, Benigno Aquino, came back from exile, tried to organize a democratic opposition, and the regime was so brazen they shot him as soon as he stepped off the plane onto the tarmac at the Manila airport. But the Reagan administration, and with bipartisan support, kept on supporting Marcos because he was this good anti-communist. And there was an armed communist movement, the New People's Army, that was challenging him. But there had been a growing opposition. In fact, part of it, actually, interestingly enough, was on nuclear power. Westinghouse had bribed Marcos to the tune of a couple $1 million to give them a contract, and they were building this nuclear power plant literally on the slope of a volcano. And they had, and despite martial law restrictions, 20,000 people came out demonstrating and occupied the site, blocked the construction of it. There were these grassroots movements called Welcome Bayans, or people strikes, that were organized by various leftist movements around the country, which show that even in a martial law situation, even with that extreme brutality, there was a you could challenge the regime. Now the liberal opposition, including Benigno Aquino's widow, Cora Aquino, and other people say we've got to challenge Marcos. How can you do it? And some of them said we need to take up arms. This is ridiculous. I mean, what do we do? But through his support of some folks from the International Fellowship of Reconciliation and others that had background in nonviolent struggle, they convinced him to try to focus on nonviolent action. And the growth of the movement there forced Marcos to have a snap election, which, much to his surprise, he lost. But he ended up. As the returns are coming in and showed he was losing, suddenly the returns stopped coming in. There was a blackout for a few hours, and lo and behold, hey, he won. But it was amazing. It was a walkout of the counters, people who were counting the ballots, saying this is a total fraud. There were some remarkable things when people tried to steal ballots, people defended them. It was a situation where you combine nonviolent action and election at the same time. It was clearly as a stolen election. Aquino and her people started about this campaign of boycotts and increased resistance between the up until the re-inauguration of Marcos, a few weeks later, and there are a couple of reform-minded officers who thought Marcos had gone too far. They were afraid that this popular movement might move things too far to the left. Tried to stage a coup, but the coup plot was uncovered. Marcos sent his troops in to wipe out General Ramos, who was leading the coup. And an amazing thing happened. You had thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people surrounded Camp Crame, where the coup had started. So you had the people protecting the military. Unarmed civilians protecting the military. Well, Marcos is ordering his troops to just gun them down, run them right over. And I want to talk, but they refused. Because these troops who were just conscripts, many of them poor, they didn't have any real stake in supporting Marcos, were faced by these nuns doing the rosary right in front of the tanks. And here's another thing I want to emphasize, because when you hear about these uprisings in various countries. They say, oh, they succeeded because it was actually a benign dictatorship. It's not like Gaddafi or Assad, others gunned down people. But the fact that you look at these things, in many of these cases, like with Marcos in the Philippines, like with Bin Ali in Tunisia, like with Honecker in East Germany, and a number of other cases, the dictator did order the troops to gun down the protesters. But they refused. Because remember, a dictator is only as powerful as people's willingness to obey. And they refused. And then the strike spread. Massive resistance all across the country. And when the swearing in time, and then the Reagan administration, which initially had backed Marcos, even in the face of his blatant fraud, was saying, uh-oh, this isn't working. Because the American people, who really didn't know much about the Philippines before then, just it was a good anti-communist ally of the United States, saw this going on. It was very inspiring. In fact, I have a friend who had a 7-year-old girl who was watching what was going on in television. She looked at her parents and says, "Mommy, I want to be a Filipino." It was really cool. It was really, really inspiring. And so, this put the Reagan administration, who supported some of these god-awful regimes, death squads, just horrible, horrible stuff all around the world, counter-terrorists, you name it, but it became politically impossible to continue supporting Marcos. He sent Senator Laxalt, a conservative Republican senator from Nevada, on the Foreign Relations Committee to try to work out some arrangement. But when the inauguration day came, it became, in the words of Reagan spokesman, a kind of a private affair, because he had the swearing-in ceremony inside Malacanang Palace, while Puerto Aquino had a more public ceremony. So the question was, you had parallel governments. Who is the recognized leader? And this is another important thing about nonviolent resistance. Now, when you think about traditional concepts of power, this is both mainstream concepts of power, but also, Marxist perspective as well. Power is like you see it like a pyramid. The power at the top. In order to get rid of power, you got to knock that piece off the top. Presumably with military force. Well, this implies what happens in the Philippines and a lot of these other cases. It implies a more pluralistic model of power. Again, that the dictator is only as strong as people's willingness to obey. And this is something I think anarchists and others have been talking about for years. It's like the real way to power. The real way is not just to knock off the top, but create alternative institutions, parallel institutions that undermine it from within. And so basically, in other words, Marcos was not forcibly removed from Malacanang Palace. This made sure that Malacanang Palace was the only part of the Philippines he still had any control of. And at that point, Reagan sent in a helicopter to get him out of there and sent him to Guam and eventually exile in the United States. But one other lesson from the Philippine Revolution was very inspiring in a lot of ways. But unfortunately, it was unfortunate that the momentum didn't continue, because even though the Philippines is much better off now, that you don't have the death squads coming in the middle of the night, unions and peasant pleas and those people can organize openly. It's still a pretty plutocratic system. It still has your classic kind of neo-colonial economy and maldistribution of wealth and the like. And so you really, I've always argued that liberal democracy is necessary but not sufficient step towards a more just society. Liberal democracy does allow political space. And let me just give you an example of another that illustrates that gives political space where there's potential, if it is used correctly, to create more radical change. And the example I want to give for that actually is Bolivia. Now, Bolivia was in a series of brutal military dictatorships, and starting in December 1977, with 4 women going on a hunger strike in La Paz, expanded to many hundreds joining them, created this mass movement which forced the dictator who'd been in charge for the better part of a decade to re-legalize the mine workers union, and like it's been a strong syndicalist tradition in Bolivia. And eventually he was forced to resign, and they had they elected a center-left government, and things were looking pretty good. But then a general by the name of Ignatius Bush seized power, and when people rose up, he ended up gunning down people by the scores. And more people were killed in the first week of him coming to power than the entire 8 years of the previous dictator. But people kept resisting until 2 weeks after he seized power, there were over 600,000 people massing in the streets of La Paz, which is bigger than the entire population of the city at that time. And the country was at a standstill. And the leader of the COB, the Trade Union Federation, and other human rights activists walked to the palace, walked right into the general self-proclaimed president's office and said, "What's your program?" He looked at them, looked out the window at the 600,000 people in the street and said, "Yours." And again, that says a lot about the nature of power. Okay? You can be in the president's office, but if you don't control what's out in the streets, you don't have power. Well, to their credit, Cobb didn't say adopt our program. They said, "Get the hell out of here." He did. The coup lasted only 15 days. Again, a central-left government, Democratic government, in this case under the first woman president in Latin America, came to power. But there was one more coup. This one was planned more in advance. And it was interesting, when the military moved in, they did not seize the presidential palace first. They did not seize Congress first. The first place they attacked was the COB headquarters, which had been sort of the headquarters of the human rights and the progressive movement, because they knew where the real power in Bolivia was. And they actually executed a number of people right there on the spot. And resistance grew. It was, again, brutally suppressed, hundreds killed. This time, Bolivia had already, under dictatorships, had been authoritarian, but it was kind of it wasn't a particularly efficient kind of oppression. But this time they brought in advisors from the U.S.-trained national security states in neighboring Argentina and Chile and Uruguay, real nasties. They kind of put the repression on a whole nother level. Well, people realized that outright resistance was not going to work at this point. That they had demonstrations, people would just be gunned down. So they decentralized the resistance, including people's theater, forms of cultural resistance. They knew this was going to be, this was not going to be 15 days. This was going to be quite a few months, and it was about a year and a half. But eventually, they too were able to force down this dictator. And they've had, democratic elections ever since. No more military rule. The problem, though, was this is about we're getting into the early 1980s now, and this is the time when the economic situations, the debt crisis, and everything was at the point where the International Monetary Fund could pretty much write the rules, and Bolivia is a poorest country in South America. In fact, by some measures, it's probably the poorest country in the hemisphere after Haiti. And in the Arab world, a majority are indigenous. The only other country besides Guatemala with that distinction. And they're forced to fall into these neoliberal solutions, which made things a lot harder when people protested, even though it was a nominally democratically elected government. There were small-scale massacres, and not as bad as during the military rule, but the repression was real. Despite this, people kept on organizing. And this is important, again, and eventually you had a dramatic growth of civil society that had come to the fore during the uprisings against these three dictatorships in the previous years. The Indian communities, which had been, very much kind of their own local things, united. I mean, the indigenous people from the Amazon to the Quechua and the Altiplano, everybody in between, unprecedented degree of organizing. And it was from that they could build what they call the movement towards socialism and the eventual election of Evo Morales, one of the progressive governments in the world right now. And again, it's an indication, again, a reminder that we hear about these pro-democracy revolutions, and those of us on the left say, oh yeah, but it's not really, it's still, capitalist, the whole basic system is still in place. And yes, that's true to a point. But again, that the liberal democracy, and despite all the limitations of liberal democracy, having that political space, as we've seen in Latin America, where these dictators fell, most of them by the by the early mid-'80s. But in that interim period, you had trade unions, you had indigenous groups, you had the Progressive Church, you had women's groups, human rights students, others who could more openly mobilize, get the training, empower, initially through small local action, to the point where they could actually start electing governments. And we're starting to see slowly some real structural changes challenging some of the more basic principles of international capitalism. And remember when everybody assumed the free trade agreement with the Americans was a given, that nothing was going to stop it? No way. I mean, that's never going to happen. And it's both because of the resistance we had here in North America, of course, but in large part because of the organizing, the resistance that we saw in much of Latin America. I wanted to look at one more case, or two more cases actually. Now, as we all know, it was not NATO that brought down communism in Eastern Europe. It was Polish dock workers, East German church people, Czech intellectuals, Estonian folk singers, and millions of ordinary people. And what's interesting is that most of these movements were initially on the left. A lot of people don't realize, if you look at the original Solidarity Manifesto from Poland, they talk literally of worker control and means reduction. And in groups like KOR, Civic Forum, and others, these were democratic socialists and even left and the left of that. But for a variety of reasons, unfortunately, Easter instead became kind of a neoliberal model. Though we are seeing some changes and some improvements there, but we saw how in Serbia it was amazing to see how easily in Eastern Europe the Communist Party apparatchiks suddenly became born again free market people, because it was always about power. If you're in a communist society, you want power, you get into the Communist Party. In capitalist society, you want power, you become capitalist. So it was not. It was a pretty easy transition for most of them. And we really saw this in Serbia, where Milosevic came out of the Titoist, independent Marxist tradition to flipping almost overnight into this kind of Serbian ultra ethno-chauvinist ultra-nationalist. And you had these horrific wars and everything, but you had a group of Serbian students who had seen their generation be destroyed, were horrified at the crimes committed in the name of their nation, and they rose up And in the way of '95, early 1996, and a nonviolent pro-democracy movement. But the United States, at that point, feeling pretty favorable about Milosevic, because he cooperated in the deal around Bosnia, actually supported the crackdown against them. They tried to revive again. They were starting to get some real progress in late 1998, but then the NATO bombing set them back again, because obviously when your country's being bombed, people tend to rally around the flag, and these oppositionists that they very much opposed Milosevic are also very much opposed to the bombing and join their fellow countrymen in opposing that. But they kept on organizing, and I actually got to work with some of the folks there, and despite some conspiracy theorists that say, oh, there's CIA because they got NED funding and that kind of stuff. They did get some NED funding, but because it helped them pay for fax machines and computers and that kind of stuff. But they're never beholden to the United States. I know them personally. They're all left of center, and some of them are actually pretty radical. But it's interesting to see their embrace of nonviolent struggle. In fact, one of them mentioned how the CIA actually came to them and offered them arms. And in fact, you guys are crazy, This is not going to work against Milosevic. The interesting thing about these guys, when we think about nonviolent resistance, a lot of people stereotype as, Gandhi or King, you have to be this, spiritual, pacifist and have this great model of moral leadership. None of us can realistically attain. This serves, they're atheists. They drink, they smoke, they tell dirty jokes. They're politically incorrect on a whole number of levels. But they are engineers by training. In fact, they're in engineering school because that and medicine are the only two ways you can get out of the draft. But they're engineers by training. And so they kind of thought things like engineers do. Okay, what's the structure here? How can you weaken the structure? What are the pillars of support of the regime? How do you weaken the pillars of support? What do we need to do? And they figured out a way that they realized that nonviolent resistance was the way to go. And they took on this almost kind of punk aura, outrageous guerrilla theater. I mean, they were kind of they're inspired by Gene Sharp and some of the people who've done some of the academic work on strategic nonviolent action, but they were also inspired by the situationists of France in '68 and as well as by Monty Python. They were, again, very clever. So there's a great documentary actually called "Bringing Down a Dictator," which tells their story. I'm a little uncomfortable with it because it was about the time of the invasion of Iraq, and they were trying to say, oh, there are better ways of bringing down dictators. So they almost overplay the NED support and stuff. But it's still a good documentary because, again, it shows how they started very small. And, again, through the logical sequencing of tactics and doing all these great dilemma actions, just making making the regime look silly and stupid and petty, by what they were doing. And they were able to build this mass movement, starting from a pretty small group. And some of them, Ivan Morovitz and Popovich, have actually spoken at Occupy forums around the country. They're very supportive of what we're doing here. Again, these are, despite the conspiracy theories, they are not CIA. I tell you, they've really stressed this kind of strategic thing. They made a handbook actually on their site. I've gotten a little concerned about that. They've actually formed a group called Canvas, the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies. Canvas, a PDF.org is worth looking at. I've been a little nervous because I know at least one or two of them have not practiced kind of discernment. I wish they would in terms of who they've worked with. They a couple times even worked with some of the Venezuelan oppositionists, which I'm not very happy about, obviously. But by and large, though, that they're tacticians, strategists. There's some very good things to learn from them. Finally, I'd like to talk about the anti-apartheid movement. And we see here we had a case where, and I was involved in this very much as well. At the same time, I was involved in the anti-nuclear power struggle. I was actually probably the single most. I was actually founder of the divestment campaign at Oberlin College, where I was an undergrad in the late 70s. But the debate there became between the administration, who was opposed to divestment, saying, "Oh, the way to end apartheid, we oppose apartheid as much as you do, but the way to end apartheid is to deny, liberalize, and influence the foreign capital." But on the other extreme, you had these one-minded student Marxists saying, "Armed struggle is the only way," and when the ANC would march into Pretoria, and and I remember thinking, I would never make moral judgments against people who feel the need to take up arms when they're oppressed, especially as a white North American. But I knew enough about South Africa to their history, the geography, the way the townships and bamboo stands were laid out, the lack of sanctuary, a whole bunch of other things. You realize that armed struggle really would not work there. Again, this is South Africans. This is not a foreign colonial war like the Portuguese in Africa, the U.S. and Vietnam. I mean, the whites that live in South Africa almost as long as whites in North America. Millions of them. This is a different kind of struggle. I really cannot. Again, this is not a moral judgment or anything. This is just, again, thinking strategically. But they said I was wrong. I was this bourgeois, liberal pacifist, and sure they'll win. They can hide out in the mountains and jungle. South Africa? Don't really have that. Anyway, this is kind of savannah. It's not a good place for the war. Anyway, but like the administration had a ready-made ideology to kind of plan on a country they really didn't know that much about. They ended up being purged from the movement, kicked out. But sure enough, what we saw in South Africa was that the ANC, on principle, never renounced armed struggle. But it never got beyond periodic, blowing up of some electrical pylons 1 week, maybe a bomb at a police station, another week. It was never got to be an advanced armed struggle.
Wait, it stopped the regime from doing stuff in Namibia, right? It didn't happen in South Africa proper, but...
No. There was an armed struggle in Namibia. There was an armed struggle in Namibia and Angola. That's very different. We're talking about Indian apartheid in South Africa. But what happened is people recognized, and ANC, in fact, the ANC went to Hanoi to talk with General Diop, who led the resistance against the French and the Americans. In fact, I was in Vietnam the first time last year, and guess what? He's still alive. He's 103 years old. They just can't kill that guy, But anyway, and they say, "Well, why can't you advise us to how we can overthrow the regime?" I said, "Guys, it's not going to work where you are. This is not like Vietnam." And realized that, and he said, "Hey, look, you guys are 80+% of the population. They're totally dependent on your labor. If you don't cooperate, if you're, they're too small to totally control you." And sure enough, what they did was they built up alternative institutions, and the townships became ungovernable. They set up their own parallel governments, parallel judicial systems, alternative institutions. So the townships, even though you had the South African army and their what they call the hippos, these armed personnel carriers and stuff, killing people and stuff, but they weren't running them anymore. The actual governance of the townships was in the hands of the United Democratic Front and the popular opposition. COSATU, the revived trade union, had strikes that brought the country to a standstill. They were completely dependent on black labor for everything. But that was only part of it, because something else was happening. And that was the international solidarity movement. That was pushing for divestment, pushing for sanctions. Because it was foreign capital that was making the numerous numerous duplications and inefficiencies of the apartheid system to work. It was foreign capital that was helping them. That was, it was foreign GM supplying the jeeps and trucks to the South African police and military. There was no direct military aid, but there was that kind of support. We were buying the gold and the diamonds and the other minerals. We were there. The IBM was supplying the computers, where they could keep track of people. Foreign capital was very much part of keeping the system in place, and this movement for sanctions grew dramatically. In 1978, Andrew Young, former civil rights activist, African-American minister, had a long arrest record, worked very closely with Dr. King. He was Carter's ambassador to the United Nations. He vetoed sanctions against South Africa. And yet, 8 years later, Congress, with a Republican majority in the Senate, was able to override Reagan's veto to impose sanctions. The movement had gotten that big. In fact, it got Republicans for it. In fact, co-sponsor of the House version, along with Ron Dellums, was a Georgia congressman by the name of Newt Gingrich. That's how big the movement had become. And I was at this international forum in Genoa, Italy, several years ago, and I happened to be on a panel with none other than F.W. de Klerk, the last white South African president, and we had dinner afterwards, and he and his wife and me and a colleague of mine, and he acknowledged that it was they were ready for any kind of military contingency. They were more than ready. They were kind of bring it on. But the nonviolent resistance within South Africa made it very difficult. That's why they ended up getting these goose flags, and like with the Cotton Freedom Party, there's kind of sow division and violence within the black community. But they were not ready for the nonviolent resistance there, and then it was a nonviolent resistance in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere that forced these governments to finally impose sanctions, and that's when the white capitalist class in South Africa came to the Afrikaner, the white minority elite, and said, "Hey guys, the gig is up. You have to release Mandela. You have to negotiate into this." So I think one of the big illustrations I think of South Africa is the importance of international solidarity, and that's why East Timor, for example, is free today. By any measure, East Timor was a hopeless cause. A tiny country occupied by very powerful neighbors, supported by the United States, but it was basically the solidarity movement here in the United States and Britain and Australia that basically got to the point where when the Indonesian economy tanked in 1998, the Southeast Asian financial crisis, these countries went to the Indonesian government and say, "Hey guys, sorry, the gig is up. We can't support you anymore because of this East Timor thing. We need to bail you out. This is really important. This half island isn't worth it to you. Give it up, and then we can help you out." And we see more freedom. So I raise these just as kind of different examples, trying to illustrate different points about the power of nonviolent action, how it can be applied strategically. But again, it has to be applied strategically. You need, just like guerrilla warfare. It's not even a question of violence versus nonviolence. It's a question of what works. Like a guerrilla army cannot expect success by a frontal assault on the capital in the early going. They have to start with hit and run tactics. Build their base, build up alternative institutions, et cetera, and kind of grow their support. Anybody study guerrilla war know I'm not talking about. A similar thing in terms of nonviolent resistance, that it's, again, mass protests or even occupying a particular geographic space, may not always, may not be the best or only tactic, and when it is, it may be very effective for one phase of the movement, but not for another phase of the movement. You need to think strategically. What are our strengths and weaknesses? What are their strengths and weaknesses? What are the pillars of support that hold up the system and how we undermine them. And this is what these successful movements have been able to do. And I'm happy to elaborate on any of this, and when we get to the proper time of that.
My name is David Salton. Thank you very much to Kate Tal and to our friends at Occupy Forum. I used to be in the facilitation committee of Occupy San Francisco, and one thing that would happen almost every meeting, especially early on, is we'd sort of do a straw poll about what people wanted to do. And usually half the people wanted to have a political discussion about what's up in the world and what do we do about it, and the other half wanted to figure out logistics for tomorrow's camp. And so very grateful that Occupy Forum have actually continued to create a space where we don't have to work out tomorrow's porta potty logistics. So I was going to talk a little bit about a mass direct action I was involved in Seattle in 1999, shutting down the WTO. Talked a little bit about that, and then today I sort of and we did some reflection on what made that work afterwards. And so today I was like, well, that was a long time ago. So I started to think about, well, what was successful about Occupy. So I'll throw out some ideas that I started to think about this morning and hopefully get people's brains spinning. Was anyone here in Seattle in 1999? Yay! So, I guess to flash back, in the 90s, the 1% globally were doing what they do, which is figuring out how do they better concentrate power and wealth in their own hands and push back on us ordinary people around the world who are fighting to, increase justice and people power. And so they came up with the idea of free trade, the idea that you would make these agreements between nation states, and if you've made a free trade agreement, it would override the ability of local communities, state communities, or nations to actually protect their communities, set environmental or work standards. And so the kind of prototype one was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. And so basically what it said is that, okay, our governments are signing these treaties, and now none of those countries or states or communities within those countries can pass any deals that violate our ability to trade freely. And what that in fact meant is we couldn't pass anything that would violate corporations' ability to trade freely. So if you wanted to say we want to protect workers' rights or environmental standards, or we don't, human rights somewhere, that was actually considered a violation of free trade agreement. So one example is there's a gasoline additive in California called MTBE, and it's very toxic. It's carcinogen. A lot of folks who got cancer in California probably got it because it's in a lot of our groundwater because it's being added. Communities for a Better Environment, a lot of other folks said, this is a horrible toxin, let's get rid of it. They did a grassroots campaign. They got it banned in the state of California. Well, the Canadian corporation that produced it says, hey, this is actually a violation of free trade. They took it to the WTO court, which is a unaccountable tribunal of 3 appointed judges with no ability to appeal. And they said, yeah, you're right. And so we actually, as a result of that, continue to have MTBE in our gasoline, even though, we had a grassroots campaign, we got our state government to ban it, it made sense, but because of that free trade agreement. So on a lot of different levels, it outraged anyone who's fighting against any level of corporate power, because it's basically a corporate coup to override any kind of ability for us to struggle through local, state, federal governments. So take that NAFTA and blow it up globally, and that's what the World Trade Organization was attempting to do. It was taking the entity that had sort of seized power in the world post-World War II, said we want to expand our power into every corner of the planet and create this global so-called free trade or corporate trade agreement that would override anyone's ability on the planet to assert their power to protect their community, their workers' rights, their environment, so forth. And that was actually, that was begun in the mid-1990s as actually, I believe when NAFTA went into effect, the one-year anniversary, I think it was, that the agreement to come up with the World Trade Organization. So people they were developing it, they were planning on implementing it. This was basically the global 1%'s plan on how they were going to run the world and further concentrate power and wealth and keep us down permanently and institutionally. Had a series of meetings leading up to it. We found out in California that they were going to have the next WTO meeting here in the United States. It was initially, they were debating between San Diego and Seattle. And so we initially thought, shit, San Diego? That's like our state. And the year before it was in Geneva, and there had been massive protests. Movements around the planet had gone there. It was the biggest civil unrest in that city since the 1960s. And, you know, those of us who have been following what had been happening there, those of us who were inspired by the Zapatistas, who were the ones that initially stood up to NAFTA and set up a global network called People's Global Action that had organized the protests in Geneva. And we said, okay, this is our chance to step up in the United States. And we were pretty sure it was going to be in San Diego, and we'd be able to get all our friends in the East Coast and the Northwest to come and hang out on a sunny beach and then have protests. But they ended up doing it in Seattle. So on this flash forward, massive organizing campaign by a bunch of different sectors of movements, unions, community groups, and also sort of radical direct action folks, Earth First, anarchists, students, anti-sweatshop folks, and that was the part that I was organizing in a network called Direct Action Network. And our position was that the institution, the WTO, had throughout its entire existence shut out any kind of democratic participation or decision making, so that we viewed this is not a legitimate body. We don't want to just try and have further input, which has already been shut down, and so we want to try and shut it down. And we saw this as a perfect opportunity for both mass civil disobedience, but also the group I was in at that point was Art and Revolution, and we did street theater, and we were trying to infuse art, culture, puppets into social movements. So we also saw it as a place to highlight using cultural resistance in the streets in an unprecedented scale. So we formed a network up and down the coast. Said, let's throw down the gauntlet. The first day on November 30th, the first day of the conference, we said, let's try and shut it down. And the networks organized up and down the coast until November 30th. And on the morning of November 30th, it was pouring rain. But probably a couple thousand of us got up before dawn, organized. There's probably over 1,000 of us were organized into affinity groups, had made the plan and coordinating spokes councils leading up to it, divided the downtown Seattle area that was being held in the convention center into pie slices because we got tired of arguing about where the police barricades might be. It would just take up the whole meeting. So we'd say, okay, that's your pie slice, your group has that one. There's a police barricade, no matter where the hell they are, that's your job is to shut that part down. So we actually, and that worked out well because we got different clusters of affinity groups to take responsibility for different pie slices. And so on the morning of November 30th, everybody basically knew what to do. We had 2 marches coming from both directions, one from near Pike's Place Market, the park near there, and one from the hill on the community college up on the hill, Capitol Hill. And we marched from both directions at 7 a.m. And some groups deployed independently beforehand. Some of them marched and came out. But by about 8:30, most of the area was shut down. And there were some intersections where there'd be 60 people in block boxes, other places where people did. A lot of the Earth First folks had come and sort of taken their forest tactics and escalated up a couple notches on a mass scale for the city. And there's also a long tradition of direct action. So we pretty much had it surrounded, and by about 8 o'clock, an amazing thing started to happen where a lot of the places right around the convention centers, NGOs and delegates and lobbyists were trying to get in, and people there were just linking arms. And there was because of the groundwork that had happened, there was this thing that happened where it shifted from being those thousands of us who were in affinity groups who had a plan and at least your friend had been to a meeting, right? Like the organized resistance, to where people who had never had any contact with any organization but had heard about it through the newspapers or through flyers or something, or been educated through the 20 no WTO groups around the city, they just joined in. So it shifted from an organized resistance into a public rebellion, in that ordinary people would step up, link arms, and we were physically confronting these delegates and NGOs saying they needed to get in. Some of them would physically try and push through. Sometimes you get these guys in suits with briefcases literally diving into a crowd of, like, you know, grandmas and college students and whoever. By about 10 o'clock, we got news that the opening of the WTO was postponed because no one had been able to get in, or very few people had been able to get in. And by about 10:30, they started shooting tear gas and doing mass pepper spraying of our blockade lines. And amazingly, we trained probably a couple thousand people, but a lot of people who had no training or no organization connection basically stuck with it. And we kept it shut down from dawn till dusk. And so the first day of the World Trade Organization, the most powerful institution on the planet, and that it was attempting to be, was actually shut down the entire day through initially a couple thousand of us, and then joined a little bit later in the day by a labor march led by the AFL-CIO, who amazingly were mobilizing their forces, but sadly were actually bringing them to within a half mile and then trying their damnedest to get them as far away from the direct action folks as they could. So they actually had their marchers linking arms saying, all right, labor folks, let's march away from the WTO. But we had people with bullhorns, and a lot of the rank and filers could smell the tear gas. We said, hey, people are being tear gassed, we shut it down, we need your solidarity. So about half of the marchers joined us, so our numbers doubled. Whereas the authorities had thought, oh, well, these less organized people, they'll just march off with the labor folks. So a bunch of other stuff happened. There was a black bloc that took out a bunch of corporate windows. There was a Global South delegation that did a march led by Filipino community activists in Seattle, but had pulled in a lot of international delegates and a lot of people of color contingents from around the U.S. So they were marching around. The labor movement, there had been a student walkout, so we were joined by thousands of students walking out of their campus. High school kids, there's a cab drivers, wildcat strike. A ton of ordinary working people had just taken the day off as sort of an informal strike. The police later on in the day freaked out and started calling on the fire department to use their fire hoses on us. And to their credit, the firemen, both the rank and file and the union leadership, basically refused. Good. We gave them a thank you cake the next month. So it was an amazing day. A lot of heavy repression. A lot of people got chemical, were injured. Not a lot of arrests that day. We continued through the week. Next day, mass arrests. People occupied the jail and negotiated. We actually negotiated everyone out of jail, which was about 500 people on our own terms because we had created such a crisis. And the delegates from the Global South, who were being pressured by much stronger movements in their own country, and then seeing opposition in the streets of the United States, sort of breaking the myth that we support our government, actually were either pressured or bolstered into refusing to get bullied by the rich countries. So the entire talks fell apart at the end of the week. We had sort of reoccupied the jails, everyone got out. So it was a pretty clear victory for mass people power. So, series of mass direct actions, and one of the self-critiques I have is those of us in the direct action network we were definitely just one piece of it, but we set up the infrastructure for the direct action. We never actually sat down and said, okay, here's the things that we did that worked, here's the things we did that were kind of messed up, but it still worked. And so as a result, the folks who did A16 at the IMF World Bank in April and a whole series of mass actions that on some levels were often referencing that, they didn't actually have our insight as organizers, so I was very self-critical of that. And so a bunch of years ago, a bunch of my friends who were involved in it, and I got together and we said, well, what were the elements that made it effective? So I'm just going to walk through some of those, and then I'm going to flash forward to the last year and look at Occupy. So there was a clear what and why logic, and that people understood the logic of the direct action. We were trying to physically shut down the WTO. The narrative was they'd shut out any kind of democratic participation, so it wasn't a legitimate body, and we were going to try and shut them down, which gave a great logic to the direct action. It was like, we need more people to link up. They're getting through there. And people just got that, so it gave a great logic to the direct action. It was broadly publicized on a whole bunch of levels, whatever your opinion about corporate media. Both, it was on the front page of we were very public and transparent. We knew that we couldn't be sneaky with enough people to shut it down, so we basically said, let's let the whole world know. So front page of the Seattle Times was, these people are going to try and shut it down. We had press conferences, we had lead-up actions to try and give a flavor. We printed up 50,000 broadsheets with background information. There were 20 neighborhood groups that each did teach-ins. We did a road show from Santa Cruz to Vancouver, BC, and did trainings. So mass publicity, and then mass training. I mentioned the training, but also we had a core of about 1,000 people organized into affinity groups. And then we had sort of broader circles of people who were allied groups, like the students and other folks who joined in. So mass training organization, decentralization, the fact that everyone had a common plan and a basic agreement of how it would work. It didn't matter if any one group or group of individuals disappeared or didn't wake up in time, or some groups didn't, or sometimes the cops, a bunch of people tried to bring what do you call them, tripods, which are big poles where you set them up in the street, you climb on top and they can't get you down. And people tried to do clever things like disguise them as giant carrots, hoping the cops would affinity group walking with this like 20-foot really heavy carrot, and they got snapped by cops. But the fact that it was decentralized and everybody had a common plan essentially meant that we were actually better organized than the police, and that we were able to respond quickly. We weren't waiting for a command from above. We sort of knew who was responsible for what. So we were able to be much more fluid than the police and essentially out-organize them. Media and framing, we had actually done a huge amount to tell our story, to make ourselves seem like reasonable people standing up against corporate power and make the WTO seem like the fringe extremists. We had consciously chosen to organize openly, and that we were pretty clear that we can't get enough people to sneak up and do it. So we did do, the element of surprise came in as like, you guys over there, you're responsible for pie slice B. We don't know what the hell you're going to do, figure it out yourself, but come to the meeting and coordinate with the other pie slices. And so that was the element of surprise, is that, they couldn't infiltrate every affinity group, and every affinity group didn't always know what they're going to do until the next day, and they were really, a group could change its decision, so there's no way they could actually know what we were doing. The last one is that we had action agreements, and that means that that we basically made some core decisions as we started organizing, that we were gonna make decisions through a spokes council. We were gonna start at 7 a.m. And we had decided that we thought that it was actually going to be physical bodies and objects blocking that was going to be most effective. So we asked people not to break stuff or not to fight the cops. And there was some controversy with that with the black bloc, but essentially that was what happened with the majority of folks. And those were the tactics that actually physically shut it down. And so that worked out very well. If we hadn't had those agreements, it would have been hard. actually, had we not had those agreements, we would not have been able to get the numbers of people to participate to physically shut it down. And, you know, smashing windows is another thing, but that actually did not help shut down the WTO. That was created a different spectacle. So those were the agreements. And I guess one short flash forward is on March 20th in 2003, the day after the Iraq War started, Direct Action to Stop the War in San Francisco pretty much used the same model to shut down the San Francisco financial districts. And we got together with a bunch of bike freaks who pretty much knew traffic patterns, and they said, they said, we think if you shut down these 20 intersections, you'll pretty much create total gridlock in the community. So we did that. So people, instead of pie slices, they took on intersections. We designed it kind of like a restaurant menu, so you could do takeout, traditional fare, which was government institutions and corporations. So we actually had everyone take on all the war-related corporations, the federal buildings, different government-related institutions, and then key intersections. And on 7 a.m. the day after the war started, 20,000 people showed up in the financial district, and it, very similar to Seattle, it moved from the 1,000 of us or so who were in affinity groups to people who had read about it, the Chronicle, got the flyer, their friends had called them the night before, and they saw people blocking traffic in the street, and pretty soon it moved from an organized resistance into a public mass resistance. So I'm going to flash forward to a couple, just started to think about the Occupy movement, and I guess why this is important. I actually came out of the anti-nuclear movement, similar to my friend here, and you know, what worked about the anti-nuclear power and weapons movement is that people had innovated. And my impression, I was a little young during Vietnam and the New Left, but the folks that were my that I learned from my mentors at that time, some of them are around in the room, but they had looked at what didn't work about the New Left, about, you know, the women's movement, the sexism, and the model of patriarchy. You know, they looked at a whole different things, and they innovated and created new models. So some of the models that we use in Occupy, like affinity groups, direct action, some of the training stuff, actually came out of people looking at the New Left and saying, hey, that didn't work, let's try something different. So in the 70s, in the anti-nuclear movement, you know, they tried, and a lot of this from Seattle came out of that. So my point is that for those of us who are around today, we actually need to, no one's going to figure it out. We need to think hard about what is it that worked in the Occupy movement and what didn't work, and how can we innovate and figure it out. Because, you know, movements go in cycles. I mean, the last year plus was one cycle that's continuing on some level, but there's going to be lots more cycles. And I think how effective, how far those cycles go depends on this sort of like, you know, if your goal is to catch rain, you know there's going to be cycles of rainstorms. But if you have your water catchment systems in place, just like if you have your mass movement systems in place, you can do a lot more with it, rather than like, oh shit, it's raining outside. Run, take it, yeah. So these were some thoughts I had on the elements that made Occupy succeed. And obviously it wasn't a single mass direct action, but it was sort of a popular uprising. Is that common sense framing? People were pissed at Wall Street, the 99 to 1% Wall Street corruption. The fact that there was confrontation, and I guess I'll backtrack. I was actually involved in some coalitions of community-based organizations and unions that had actually put 20,000 people on Wall Street in May of 2011. You know, very admirable. I flew out to New York and made art with some of my anarchist friends out there, and we got lots of flags and pretty stuff out on the street. But the interesting is, like, why is it with all those resources and, you know, offering a critique of Wall Street when the whole country is pretty transparent that we've just been screwed royally in 2008, why did that not catch on when community-based organizations were doing that and unions were doing that? And why did it open up a political space when Occupy did that? So that's partly why I think it's important to scratch your head. The fact that the Occupies in New York, San Francisco, and other cities, it started a bunch of city places, that was easily replicable. No matter where you live, you occupy a piece of public space. So that was key. the fact that it was really open to participation on a bunch of different levels. You could pretty much show up and make yourself useful. There were GAs, working groups, you know. Initially it was very easy for ordinary people to plug in. You could just come and listen to a GA and get something out of it. You could walk up and talk to people, have a debate. And then the fact that it was independent and volunteer driven, the fact that, longer conversation, but that it didn't come out of the traditional forces of nonprofits, community-based organizations driven by paid staff, and unions, you know, who I consider allies, but had not been able to catalyze and open up that political space or break out of organizations that require paid staff to get things done. The fact that it was volunteer-driven opened up a space of a movement, you know, of ordinary people trying to change things. So those were three things. How's my time? So, I mean, and I think that's our job, is figure out what is it that opened up that political space. How do we keep that political space open? And, you know, if we actually want to have the revolution that we need in the United States, how do we massively expand it so that there are actually not just hundreds of thousands, but millions? So, I went a little bit further. Let me tape up. For those of you who know me, I'm sort of a visual person. No, I'm good. So I guess it's trying to kind of chart both what Occupy's challenges were, both internally and externally. So externally, I did two, which are state repression. You know, I mean, people who aren't involved or less involved are like, well, what happened? You had all these people out in the street a year ago. And I thought, this is sort of like my conversation over a beer when the person has about 4 minutes. It's like, you know, well, two of the things were that there's a huge amount of state repression. I mean, there was an element of surprise with Occupy, so they honestly weren't quite prepared and didn't know what to think or do of us. And that in San Francisco in particular, that bought us a lot of space. The fact that they didn't really know how deep the support or what would happen. So there was a certain amount of political space that bought us. But, you know, a whole range of different types of disruption, from the stuff that's obvious, like police arresting or beating people or jailing, to more subtle stuff like, you know, one of the big Occupy mobilizations was last May Day. The FBI did a very involved frame-up operation. They basically got an infiltrator to completely frame and set up 3 young people in Ohio and basically set them up to try and blow up a bridge. And it was a complete set-up framing thing. Kids got pretty light sentences, but they held a press conference on the eve of May Day, which was sort of the next big Occupy. So that it was very explicitly an attempt to marginalize this and criminalize the Occupy movement. I mean, it seems hard to argue that it was anything but a transparent attack on the movement, or, you know, a little bit more low-key. We had the San Francisco Police Department spokesperson on at least 3 of our demonstrations who put out disinformation to the police during one of our Egypt Solidarity marches. They claimed that somebody had attacked and slashed the hand of one of the police. And all of us were there. There was videotape, and there was nothing that happened at all like that, or any records. It went out nationally in the media, you know, and it was actually the police were trying to push us out of the street. Another one, folks remember the Regents meeting where they actually got scared and they wouldn't meet in San Francisco, so we had a march with the students and took over Bank of America. At that one, the same police spokesperson claimed that we were grabbing for the police guns and they were taking bottles away from us. So, and then the last one was on a year ago, on January 20th. There was a march up to the hotel, and people squatted the hotel, and somebody did actually throw something, I'm not sure what. But the PR person said that people were hurling Bibles at a way of trying to marginalize, which is like, it feels like if you went to a disinformation school, that's the kind of stuff you come up with. And we didn't have the capacity to counter and call that person out, which I wanted to do, but that was a classic disinformation. So to me, the thing you do to fight, the other part is corporate media, marginalization, disinformation, and any movement faces that. To me, the issue is how do you fight it? And for me, I use the term political self-defense, and that's natural to any movement. So then what do you do in response? They're going to try and beat the shit out of you, repress you, marginalize you. So how do you deal? And so to me, it's these four different things, which is, how organized are we? Are we able to have organizational and decision-making structures we can involve a lot of San Francisco and a lot of the diverse communities? Can we actually make decisions together and implement them? If they're doing that stuff to us, we have to be able to make decisions and respond. Thinking of like a boxer analogy, if you're a boxer and you can't make a decision, you just sort of stand there and get pummeled. The next one, I think, is being able to come up with proactive strategies and campaigns to not just go action to action or be responsive, but to actually come up with some things you can fight for that make sense, and strategies like what makes sense about how we're going to fight and win. I think the other one is reflecting and innovating, the ability to actually say, hey, how's that working? What can we do different? And especially to innovate. We see it with some of our allies in the trade union or other movements where they do the same thing they've done for 30 years. And that often would happen with Occupy is like, this is how it's done. We're going to do this till we die or whatever. As opposed to like, wow, maybe this isn't working. Let's try something different. And I'm pretty convinced movements that win are ones that learn how to innovate. And the last one is communication, is that they're going to, the system will always try and marginalize movements, and we have a strong tendency towards becoming subcultural in that, we build community, we have all these sort of identifiers and culture we build up, and which is okay, but not okay if it actually separates us off of the 99%, which often happens in social movements. So how do we actually project, tell our story, communicate with the world, and actually, with the 99.1, we started out swinging, and we actually marginalized the elites in this country and popularized ourselves, and they swung back, and they said, these are fringe radicals, they don't reflect the 99%, so that's where the fight is, and how can we project our stories, how do we, actually become a movement of millions. That's it.
Invite people to comment as well as ask questions and answers, but limit the comments to 1 minute each because we have a lot of people here. And we do also want to let people know that we want to reserve a few forums, probably in March, for strategy discussion with working groups in the city, nonprofits in the city, whoever wants to participate. Because I think what we've heard from these two speakers are some great ideas how we can organize collective strategy using all the parts to create a whole mass movement or recreate it or a second wave of the movement. So let's move into questions, answers, discussion 1 minute.
What do you choose point people? So take the discussion.
Okay, well, we'll choose Calvert. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember your number. 5, 6, 7, 8. We'll add on more. So number 1.
To build a movement, strengthen the Occupy movement, it seems that we need more clarity and more agreement on a longer-term vision for what we are seeking, and that we need to agree upon some specific concrete goals in terms of changes in public policies that would make a difference. What are your, and there's a real dilemma in terms of people wanting to know, do they want to totally overthrow capitalism? Or do they support some kind of mixed economy? And I think that apprehension among ordinary people prompts many people to shy away. So what are your thoughts about vision and goals?
Just in terms of movements I've been involved in and ones that I've looked at, on the one hand, you want to have a vision, you want to have a radical vision. But at the same time, you want to be inclusive. And so, I mean, there's some kind of reforms that are reforms that kind of buy off people to try to placate them. There are also forms that are steps forward in the direction of something more radical. And I think that and to being able to discern between the two is important, but also to say, okay, let's take two examples. In Poland, when Solidarity first took over, the Solidarity side decided that they would have a sit-in in the shipyards in Gdansk. They did not, because the opposition had tried directly to confront the communists in 76 and in 68, 56, and brutally suppressed. Instead of going to the heart of the power, they ended up just saying, okay, they wanted to change the whole system, but they started with, okay, let's just have limited demands, like recognize our free trade union, reinstate some fired workers. They're very limited, and they got that. But then they expanded it, and the solidarity grew. So you had people in other in factories and farms and intellectuals and others. It grew like crazy. The regime got nervous. They had martial law came in about a year and a half later. By that time, the movement was so big, they had to basically go underground and continue resisting. Contrast this with China, when the students all sat down in the middle of Tiananmen Square and said, "Hey, we want it all now." Where the whole system to come down. Before, building alliances with workers and peasants, if they had maybe accepted and started with limited goals like, free student union or something smaller, they could have built on their victory, showed, hey, you can win concessions if you do creative nonviolent action. They've used that as a vehicle for the next amendment, and then the next amendment, and kind of sequence it instead of going for demanding it all right now. Now, my own vision is pretty radical. I personally, I would like to see the whole capital system going, but most Americans aren't there yet. Most Americans aren't there yet. They're not quite ready to support that kind of demand. But we can, but by supporting certain demands that are in the long term consistent towards that goal, but may be limited, that may seem quite reasonable, and most people can get behind. Jump on that victory, say, hey, we won this. See, we can win. If enough people come in, we're smart enough, or whatever, that empowers people. Oh, yeah, let's join this movement because they won this small victory. But then use that for the next victory and the next victory. You get it bigger and bigger and bigger as people move in. Their broader consciousness will raise. They will see that some of these specifics, like the meltdown in 2008 and that kind of thing is just a symptom of a larger thing. And people get radicalized by being part of it. And again, empowered by these small victories. And so I think that's really, keep your eye on the prize, keep that radical vision, but recognize that you're going to have to have various steps that are consistent with that, not a distraction, not a way of placating people, but a way of the various steps that will get us to where we eventually want to be. answer from you tonight, or?
I just throw in I mean, I'm a little always conflicted because on the one hand, I grew up in sort of all the Marxist, Leninist sectarian groups from the leftover from the 70s who had like, you know, their blueprint for how they were going to do things and they were going to be the vanguard or whatever. So I actually think, you know, the old left had this thing where, you know, this is our one-size-fits-all solution and we're going to impose it on everyone, and if you disagree with this, you're wrong, and I'm going to, you know, you've all met people like that in their newspapers, but so I actually think that's a bad model on the one hand, you know, but on the other hand, I also feel like, well, reading history, it's clear to me that capitalism is incompatible with any kind of a democratic or ecologically sustainable system. And for me, further, looking at the last century of, you know, good-hearted people who tried to make change, that seizing traditional government, state power has been a trap, and that traditional representative, you know, candidate selection process still doesn't give us power. So, you know, a lot of the Latin American movements have done a lot of work, like in Bolivia, to try and figure out how do you not fall into the trap of, you know, 5 years later, your guy got elected, you know, and even with Morales, and the dude acts on behalf of foreign capital and doubles the price of gas that ordinary people need to cook their food for their kids, you know, so it's a trap. But so I balance those, and then, you know, in the short term, I look at, you know, like our friends in Occupy Bertle, Noe, and Ace, who are like, you know, they're bringing people in who are fighting. I mean, they're not going to, you know, I'm not going to go to their house and say, want to overthrow capitalism and stay with me? They're like, I'm fighting the bank to stay in my home, you know. So how do you balance that? And then, you know, and they've agreed, it's like, well, let's have a citywide moratorium and push on that. So
Just to piggyback real quick, you mentioned Bolivia. What I forgot to include, and I'll go into the detail I plan to just very briefly. The Cochabamba uprising in 2000, or the privatization, forced privatization of the water resources there, you know, played a major role, and it was an incredible victory in terms of against you know, neoliberalism. But I know Oscar Oliveira, who is one of the main leaders of that. He is still just as active right now, challenging some of Morales' policies. But that, you know, that the thing is that that they are. You know, Morales has made a huge positive difference in a lot of ways. But you've got to keep up. You got to keep the struggle. You got to keep the pressure on.
I'll just jump a little further in that the movement actually had an alternative plan to traditional representative party politicians. They wanted to have a constituent assembly that was a directly democratic alternative to the nation state, where every sector of society that was organized would send delegates, write a constitution, and actually make the decision. And actually, you know, because they noticed that even when the left parties got in, you had the same political class running stuff, and it didn't give ordinary people power. So they actually came very close. But, you know, what happens every 4 years during the election? Either you become irrelevant or you play the game. And so my friends who were there said, well, they didn't think they had the capacity for an insurrection, so they threw their lot in with Morales, and they kind of got, you know, a little trapped, some would say. And Morales' party had a slogan saying, either you're with us or you're with the fascists. So our friends, you know, who said, well, we actually believe in independent social movements, aren't part of, you know, political parties. They were like, oh, well, you're with the fascists, fuck you.
May I directly respond to your original question?
Right, so.
Okay, Beth? Wait,
You want to do a bunch of questions?
Beth, may I directly respond to the original question?
Yeah, direct response.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I think
Thank
we
you.
should go with number 2.
Just go on with the numbers.
Yeah, number 2.
So Martin Luther King said, yeah, it's a direct response. I'm not getting upset.
No, we're gonna go with the
I'm sorry, Ryan. We need to stick to this one.
Let's get on track.
Why don't you write your response down and do it your like number 7 or 8, right?
Yeah, I got it. It's fine.
Yeah, let's not have an immediate response. It takes too much time.
And can we try and like, we have 9 people now, we're gonna reopen that. So let's try and keep the responses down to a minute.
Should we just let like 5 go and not respond? Otherwise, it would,
Oh.
so it's more of a
take 5
dialogue and
questions.
less like us talking.
Yeah, let's just keep the responses to a minute. And if you have a response to a response, get on stack and then give your response or your turn.
Okay, I just got a couple of comments that maybe that both of you could respond to. One is, a lot of people got educated in the Occupy movement. A lot of people, thousands, were in the streets for the first time. We had a forum in Oakland with about 400 people. It was with anarchists, nonviolent people, panel, and Starhawk said, "Who's got all the weapons?" So a lot of activists started to realize that the police, the military, the media work for the 1%. And there was an article in the Chronicle that I cut out where the Northern California Police Association purchased 7,500 automatic weapons during the Occupy movement. I have that article. And then it was, I mean, I know a lot of anarchists, but the fighting between the anarchists and the black bloc and the police, I think it was going to happen. It came too early before we had thousands, or maybe tens of thousands of people. I mean, if that happened, in other words, our movement was growing, and that conflict, I feel, drove a lot of people away. Okay, secondly, Billy Ness, a friend of mine, he organized a group to build shanties on the UC campus during the apartheid movement. And they kept tearing it down, and he kept going back and rebuilding it for divestment. And finally, after a lot of pressure, the University of California divested $100 million. The company's doing business in South Africa. I'm trying to make that.
So talk about violence. When you use violence, you're attacking the state at the strongest point. I think power of nonviolent action is like Aikido. You're using the weight of the state against it. And it's unfortunate. I was part of the 10,000 or so people who shut down the port of Oakland that evening in October. And yet, because a handful of people smashed windows in downtown Oakland around midnight, guess what the lead headline was? Not just here, but around the world. And missed the big story, which was shutting down the port of Oakland, working with when you ever talk about the diversity of tactics, the media will always keep taking movement at its strongest, at its most violent component. Look at the Palestinians. 95% nonviolent movement. What do you hear about when you hear about Palestinian resistance? Same kind of thing. So this is not a moral judgment. I don't really respect private property rights that much personally, but just in terms of tactical and strategically, what works and what doesn't. And finally, just let me mention that there are plenty of people who identify as anarchists who do not believe in violence, who see violence as being inappropriate. Indeed, the use of violence is the ultimate kind of power over which anarchism is supposed to be against.
Did you want to say something, David?
No.
I guess this is directed towards you and your analogy about building tracks for rain and waiting for being ready for the time when those rains come. And thinking about this series that we're going to do in the forum, which would be about developing common goals and strategies. I'm wondering, I guess my question is, do you feel it's best to start to develop coalitions, start to do that building work, and sort of wait for that opportune moment, some kind of big issue to come up, or do we just get out there in the streets and raise, and just do it? And also, has Occupy seen its day? Are we in a point where we need to start thinking about some kind of newer group that doesn't carry the baggage that Occupy?
Quick response. So the first one, I'd say both. And the second one, in the global justice movement, there were sort of leftist pundits and mainstream corporate media that were writing the obituary of the global justice movement. pretty much about 3 months after Seattle, and that's sort of what people will do. I mean, I guess I work as a carpenter, so I would argue that we need a lot of different ways to measure movements, and that the only thing you look for is police confrontation mediated through mainstream media or 1,000 people in the street. That's not, what's more significant, like the 5,000 people who came out on our Solidarity Day in October of 2011, one of our marches, or that there's 50 people, 50 homeowners who get together once a week and have saved 50 homes last year from banks. So there's, and there's a ton of stuff like that going on that's deeper, less visible, but maybe more significant.
Number 4?
So thank you both very much. It's awesome to hear those speak. And just wanted to ask you, just a quick comment on the state of oppression. I mean, the media, I was sort of surprised because I was involved in Oakland and San Francisco, so I saw all the non-violence that went on. So when I would wake up the next morning and read the newspaper, it was just really sickening. I mean, it was a real dirty war that the media played against Occupy. Really from day one. It was just the Chronicle and the Tribune. It was just outrageous. But the question, I actually fell asleep last night to on TPFA. I went back in the archive. It's so funny, and I just happened to hear Sherry Epstein. She's at UC Santa Cruz, and she was talking about
Barbara Epstein.
I'm sorry, Barbara Epstein. Yeah. And so one of the keys, my question for you both is the demands. That was a big. I would get it all the time from people. My friends, family, coworkers. What are your demands? You've got to have some demands, and you can't just go out there and protest. You've got to, have goals, right? So can you both comment on that? Because she basically said that was one of the problems with Occupy.
Actually, there were a number of manifestos that did spell out things that that was ignored by the media. I think whether there actually were more demands and more things before than I think a lot of the mainstream media gave us credit for. At the same time, let's go back to what I was saying about let's think of some more short-term, achievable goals, and push those. Again, part of a more broad radical vision, but I think there's definitely a seek of demands and seek tactics that would be more appropriate, that could be more specific.
Yeah, I think 2 thoughts about demands. One is I actually believe in having stepping stone achievable goals along the way, but I also think that the system wants a movement that they can recognize and control. They want some identifiable leaders that they can get 3 of them to meet with them, cut a deal with them, have some demands, shake hands in front of the cameras, and go home. And that's I feel sometimes stuck between my friends who work in nonprofits, and they do that, and they actually win incremental positive changes for forest and water and stuff like that. But part of it is that they're not challenging, they're not looking the banker in the eye and say, actually, we really want to save this forest, and we have to abolish your institution to do it. Where you shake hands in front of the camera. So how do we get the savvy of, smart nonprofits who know how to pressure them to get a short-term deal? And then those are sort of revolutionaries. They're like, overthrow capitalism, but, how do you actually save both of them at the same time so we can actually win stuff and not have to pretend that we're going to be happy if they stop cutting down those 37 acres of forest?
Number 5?
So one thing you both mentioned was working with labor groups and different actions, like specifically referring to more radical direct action oriented labor as opposed to more traditional. But referring to cases in Bolivia as well as the WTO, and also another example of factory occupations in Argentina and the big Seattle general strike in 1919. How big do you think it is for an effective movement to be able to mobilize people within sectors of society that will have a direct impact on the functioning of the economic machinery for a movement's success?
I think there's a lot of all of us can affect the economic machinery. We don't have to be in the workplace, which is the traditional place. The last 2 urban shutdowns, Oakland was shut down by Occupy. There's some unions, but they were a minority. San Francisco was shut down by anti-war folks. Seattle was shut down by a whole bunch of us. So, that was traditional. Julie and I were reading an update to the labor history book Strike. They're writing the update for the last 25 years. And what was it, in 1970, there were something like 5,000 strike actions. And last year there were like, what, 4?
4, something, yeah.
So, working class rebellion has gone down through traditional labor union, but it's gotten up through immigrant rights and all these other spaces. And I guess the last thing I'd say, I think for a challenge, I think for Occupy is people tend to have homogenous views of the labor movement. And I guess the first thing I'd say is that, about 15% of workers are in unions, so there's no way we can actually organize a rebellion of 99% without involving a lot of them. But there's a huge spectrum of folks involved in the labor movement, some of whom are chumps for the Democratic Party, some of whom are, I would consider, more radical than almost anyone I know in Occupy. And, either they need to do a job or they want to work with immigrant workers or whatever. So I think a lot of people made the mistake of like, sold out labor, without actually saying, well, let's try and work with who we can and build relationships.
So we're on number 6, but quickly, there's a hat going around for donations, which we split between Occupy Forum for our cost and for the cafe for helping us out with space. So, and there's an email list. I don't know if it went to that side of the room, so it did. Okay, cool. So number 6.
I want to address this to David. First of all, I appreciate your octopus model for your Seattle action. But this is a straight question. One of the 8 sectors was centralization. Another one of the 8 was action agreements. And I'm rather uncertain how those two are compatible or how they work in practice.
I mean, decentralization doesn't mean lack of coordination. I mean, in Spain during the Civil War, there were, about 6 million Spaniards who lived under self-organized, self-managed, agrarian and worker-run institutions, and they actually were very well coordinated. And so there's sort of a myth sometimes perpetuated by some anarchists that decentralization means everyone does what they want, rather than that actually we're actually have dispersed leadership and everyone's operating on the same plan but in different places. And there's a researcher named Paul Bayermond who his stuff was published in RAND. He's actually a movement person on our side, but he wrote a sort of a network analysis of Seattle, and his analysis was that because we were organized horizontally, which means lots of direct communication, we had better information, were able to make decisions more quickly than the police, who had a hierarchy and had bad information and moved slowly. And that, he said that essentially, and there's been huge amounts of study of network organizing, starting with the Zapatistas, and a lot of government, military, and business has actually integrated elements of horizontal network organizing, like a computer, and that is more effective.
Thank you.
No, yeah.
I'm number 7. My question, I've asked Mr. David, they talked over the times of Occupy, so I'm going to ask it again from the hindsight of several months now. I agree with Stephen's analysis that property damage and other diversity tactics of that nature send a different message to the media, no matter how potentially justified it is to take down some physical property. It sends a different message to the media than we might want. So, given that, one of the big divisions within the Occupy movement has been over the issue of nonviolence. What is it? Do we need it? We broke apart many times on trying to get to a nonviolent agreement. How are we to ever get to success if we cannot decide on a nonviolent pathway? That's to you, David.
I mean, I often feel stuck between, we need the rebelliousness and people willing to take risks that sometimes we see in our friends in the black bloc. But I do believe that diversity of tactics is basically an agreement not to make agreements, and that any movement, whether they're armed or do street fighting and property destruction or are nonviolent, that if you can't make agreements, you don't have a strategy. You're not going to see a guerrilla movement where people say, oh, diversity of tactics, you can fire your gun whenever you want. It's like, y'all are dead, And so I actually think it's, I separate diversity of tactics. I think that's actually, I'm an anarchist. I came out of very similar places, but the anarchists, the sort of dominant anarchist scene that's adopted diversity of tactics and some other pieces, post-Seattle has pretty much gotten our asses kicked at mass mobilizations for the last 10 years because of our inability to make agreements about tactics. And, I ran in Hong Kong at the WTO with the Korean workers and farmers. They're probably the most militant street movement on the planet. And, when they needed to, they would physically fight their way through a line of riot cops and get the whole march right up to the WTO. But they also had very firm action agreements, and if somebody did something that didn't make sense where they were doing it, they're like, what the fuck? Koreans.
Just quickly add, in terms of just the empirical studies of movements, there are certain situations, the classic would be the Nazi occupation in Denmark, where sabotage did help the movement overall. Of course, that's pretty extreme. That's under Nazi occupation. Here in the United States, given how uptight Americans tend to be about property, it just doesn't make sense. And time again, empirically, it's weakened movements because, again, our greatest strength is in our numbers. We are the 99%. And if people engage in tactics that scare people away, that turn people off, it's going to keep our numbers small. We've seen at these G8 and other kind of summits, the more we have it, the numbers are going down because people are getting really pissed off or alienated or otherwise are scared or otherwise don't want to get involved, because you have black people who insist on mixing in with the nonviolent majority and throwing stuff. And there's a reason that police bring in agents provocateurs to try to stir that stuff up, because they want people to smash windows. They want people to say, why should we do what they want?
And I would actually say the flip side, so I feel stuck between that lack of strategy, and to be perfectly honest, the strongest advocates for nonviolence are too often arguing for non-confrontation. And there's a Protestant tradition in the United States of like, can we all just have a nice dinner and ignore the dead child under the fucking table? And so, if your definition of nonviolence is let's be nice to the police and not have a confrontation and not have it get ugly, which it's going to have to get if we change it, we want to minimize that, don't get hurt. But, so I actually feel like the advocates of nonviolence, I don't use the term nonviolence anymore. I actually think we should throw it in the dustbin. I use equal power, and I'm convinced if we don't talk about violence or nonviolence, then we talk about what's strategic, what will maximize participation, maximize disruption, then I'm okay with that. And I actually do think there are a lot of opportunities for property destruction. I don't think window smashing or random trashing is them, but there's a wide range of ways you can tear down fences or paint a bank or things like that.
Number 8.
So I applaud the thought of throwing the word nonviolence in the dumpster, and I challenge anyone here who believes in nonviolence to tell me how they eat without violence. What I wanted to respond to was question 1, which pertains to do we choose a movement that completely wants to destroy capitalism, or do we choose a movement that allows for a multiplicity of economic systems? And Martin Luther King said in a speech in 1968, I remember so well when I first took a stand against the war in Vietnam. And in this case, I ask you to replace war with capitalism, as pertains to your question. It says, one day a newsman came to me and said, Dr. King, don't you think you're going to have to stop now opposing the war and move in line with the administration's policy? As I understand it, it has hurt the budget of your organization, and people who once respected you have lost respect for you. Don't you feel that you've really got to change your position? I looked at him and I had to say, sir, I'm sorry you don't know me. I'm not a consensus leader. I do not determine what is right and wrong by looking at the budget of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I have not taken a sort of Gallup poll of the majority opinion. Ultimately, a genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. On some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it expedient? And then expedience comes along and asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? Conscience asks the question, is it right? There comes a time when one must take the position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but he must do it because conscience tells him it is right. I'm not done. So, in the interest of fulfilling people's assumptions based on my hair, I want to quote Bob Marley. In 1973, Bob Marley sang in I Shot the Sheriff, one day the bottom will drop out, in reference to your idea that we mustn't necessarily knock the top of a hierarchy off of it, but instead drop out from the bottom and form alternative structures. And wrote in the song Zimbabwe in 1979, so arm in arms with arms we will fight this little struggle, because that's the only way we can overcome our little trouble. My question is, what made the dropping out of the bottom of the hierarchy and the simultaneous rising up of this same population look like? And how can we have both creative alternative structures and also defend them?
And conditions in Zimbabwe, which was a military victory, and look where Mugabe went. Very repressive regime. Indeed, history has shown that authoritarian regimes overthrown non-violently, the vast majority become more democratic, become some form of democracy, whereas regimes overthrown through armed struggle, with only a handful of exceptions, have become new dictatorships and/or in terms of more factional fighting and continued violence. I think about defending in Egypt when the thugs attacked on the horses and camels and swords and chains. You had some people from the East Wing of the Brotherhood, some of the soccer, whatever you want to call them, the hooligans, the English term, whatever. These are street fighters. They knocked people off the camels, disarmed them, but then sort of detained them. They did not beat them up, they did not kill them, they did not whatever. They used the minimum amount of force to defend them. But they did not they did not beat them to a pulp, they did not kill them, they did not go around, destroying things in ways that was, that the regime would use against them. So again, I'm not talking about, when I talk about again, civil resistance, I refer to nonviolence or whatever. When I talk about not using violent means, I'm not talking about, non-resistance. That's an important distinction.
Number 9? Or did David, did you want to add
No.
anything? Number 9?
This is going to be short and sweet. I just wanted to throw out 3 letters. Number 2, PP, which is
Thank
a
you.
specific agreement, which looks like agreement, which looks like NAFTA on steroids. This is next up. I mean, this is coming at us very quickly. Here we go again.
Did you want to comment? Number 10? And then we read open stack after number 10. Here's an 11. Oh, here's a 12 also. Okay, is there a 10? Number 10.
There's one over here too.
Oh, no, I'm 10. Oh, there you go.
So when we remember that education be a better use of our resources and time, if we have enough power and numbers to actually
things you're saying, if not, I'll follow up, but yeah, there's education is important, forums like these and these and others. But when you think about being a lot of education takes place from doing, from being part of things and bringing people into the process. And one thing that's really important about a decentralized structure is it gives people who didn't think of themselves as leaders, may not have thought of themselves pretty smart because of internalized oppression, whether it be sexism, classism, or whatever, may not have really seen themselves making a difference, saying, "Whoa, I did that. I was part of this," And so, but also I think a lot of us, there is a lot to say for it. And this is one of my critiques of Occupy in general. So I think that we really do need to do a lot more than door-to-door kind of stuff. And when you think about what brought you into the movement, it probably was not somebody handing you a flyer or seeing a demonstration on TV. It was probably somebody new and liked sharing information in a way that inspired you, or got you outraged, or got you excited, or that kind of thing. So I think education is very, very, very important, both by doing, but also by reaching out and bringing in, people, and seeing how their struggles, their grievances, are ultimately connected to, the broader radical changes that we're trying to move forward.
I've actually contemplated a lot the dismantling or whatever of Occupy because I don't think it actually dismantled from the outside. I mean, you talk about state repression and the media. I remember being at rallies and telling my brothers and sisters, we can never have a bad story, ever once. We can never break a window, ever once, because people will use any excuse to sit on their freaking couches. I have many liberal, progressive friends in other land who said, wow, you're in it longer than 2 weeks? Wow, we never knew you had it in you. And I said, did you read my book? Yeah. So I know that they were waiting for something to latch onto. It's why I knew we could never have a bad story. We could never have a single act of violence. And I don't even necessarily believe in nonviolence, but I know that it was all about the story for us. I also know that people are way still too comfortable in general in America. I mean, I know we have a lot of poverty and that's growing. I know a lot of unemployment and that's getting worse. A lot of debt and it's getting more and more overwhelming and horrible every day. But it also increases the fear of rocking that boat. I have my job and my house and my car. If I rock that boat, what if I lose that too? And we have to understand what a lot of occupiers are talking about is the disassemblage of the entire system. And that is terrifying. People don't want to be hippies. They don't want to be smelly. They want to be able to shower every day with their fucking stove and cook their dinners with their plastic boxes and all that other crap. They don't want the dismantling of the system, even though they know that it's killing them. Because we're critters, right? We instinctually, everybody generally probably here knows that we are fucking ourselves. We are killing the only sphere that we can actually survive on. We got that. Except it's so terrifying to step outside of the box and rebuild the system that people want to just